Good morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Rookwood Cemetery, located in Sydney, Australia. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. Spanning over hundreds of acres, this still operational Victorian-era cemetery is the largest cemetery in the Southern Hemisphere. With around 1 million souls resting here, Rookwood is a city within a city, home to generations of Sydneysiders from all walks of life. From war heroes to pioneers, artists to activists, Rookwood holds the stories of those who helped shape the vibrant city we know today. Founded in 1862, Rookwood Cemetery, originally known as the Haslam Creek Necropolis, was established in response to the growing population of Sydney and the overcrowding of its main burial site, the Devonshire Street Cemetery. Recognizing the need for a new, more spacious cemetery, city officials following Victorian era trends sought a location away from the city center. This move was driven by the desire for a more practical, hygienic, and aesthetically pleasing site for burials. The city officials, unsure of where to look, took to placing an ad in the local government gazette in 1860, seeking land for this purpose and ideally to be located between Sydney and Parramatta. In 1862, they found just what they were looking for at Haslam's Creek, purchasing 200 acres from the estate of Edward Cohen. What was also important at the time was transportation to and from the cemetery, and ideally they wanted the grounds near a railway to accommodate the needs of families in transporting the deceased. Perfectly positioned, Haslam's Creek saw the grounds divided into sections based on denominations according to the city's census conducted in 1861. These sections were for the Church of England, the Catholic Church, Judaism, Independents or Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Wesleyans. The City of Sydney then signed the Necropolis Act of 1867, formally dedicating the cemetery, establishing cemetery trusts, and the cemetery could officially begin intermittents on the ground. The first burial was reported by the Sydney Morning Herald for 18-year-old pauper John Whalen on the 5th of January in 1867. Oddly, this burial wasn't recorded in the burial registry, but thanks to the Herald known to history. The first burial in the registry was for the 14-month-old toddler Caroline McCullen on the 7th of January in 1867, just a few days later. The grounds, however, just didn't see establishment, but the railway stations were constructed for the cemetery to bring not just families or the deceased close by, but directly into the grounds, constructing the station to first appear more like a church than a railway depot. The Haslam's Creek Cemetery number 1 stop created an appearance to visitors as if they were riding a train into a church and crossing over into the grounds. The other stations, 2 through 4, were then for families closer to their plots. Originally tin boxes or nicknamed that by the press, the buildings over time were updated into traditional brick buildings welcoming mourners and visitors. Rookwood, seeing itself needed more than ever, being in demand, also purchased another 200 acres again from the state, further enlarging the grounds for years to come. The cemetery had one problem, though. Its nearby neighborhood, Haslam's Creek, didn't appreciate being associated with the dead and officially asked to change their name. In 1879, officials granted this wish, changing the neighborhood name from Haslam's Creek to Rookwood. Yet, in a fitting way, the name change came back to haunt them when the name Rookwood also became associated with the cemetery. Then again, in 1913, pleading with officials, the neighborhood changed its name again to Lidcombe, and this time was no longer associated with the cemetery. The cemetery officially became known as Rookwood, retaining its second chance neighborhood name. Yet some believe it was a deliberate corruption of the name of Brookwood Cemetery. One of the largest cemeteries in the world opened around the same time in Surrey, England. The railway system at Rookwood Cemetery is a unique feature not commonly found in other cemeteries. Construction of the railway began in 1864, and by 1865, trains were quickly able to transport mourners and coffins to the cemetery before it even opened. Starting from central Sydney, the trains made several scheduled stops, picking up passengers and caskets at 9:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. The trains earned the nickname Unimproved Redferns, a jab at the second station near the cemetery, which was considered shabby until it was eventually upgraded, although the name lingered among locals. Two types of carriages were used for these funeral processions. One was a four-wheeled van capable of carrying up to 10 coffins, while the other, an eight-wheeled van, could hold up to 30. These were attached to the back of the train for transport to the cemetery. Upon arrival at station number 1, coffins were unloaded using a hand propeller wheeled litters. While the use of the railways to transport the deceased was not unique, other countries in Europe and America had similar systems. The integration of a railway line within the grounds, with multiple stops, set Rookwood apart. However, by 1948, with the expansion of the cemetery, the introduction of road processions, the railway service was phased out and funeral trains came to a halt. The stations, especially the first in all its splendor, was offered to the Joint Committee of Necropolis trustees for the low price of £1. However, due to cost and upkeep, though, the offers were rejected and all but one platform was demolished. The platform thankfully saved was Cemetery Station number 1 and was sold to a Reverend Buckle for £100 in 1951. It was then moved to Cranbrough in 1957, where it became the All Saints Church of Canberra. Part of what makes Rookwood so special is its interments from the Victorian era to now showcase Australian history throughout the years with its burials, ranging in style, tradition, and interments. From paupers' graves, large mausoleums in Gothic splendor, vaults, and modern day green burials, its array of interments is astonishing. The cemetery feels like it's separated into chunks of time, standing still for its residents. Almost as if when they passed, the cemetery took their plot and froze it in time, making them know their era will never be forgotten. What is also extremely impressive is that over 90 different religious and cultural groups are showcased within the grounds with their own rituals and customs. Burial or funeral technicians, formerly known as gravediggers employed on the grounds, are required to go through training learning customs and how to safely lower coffins into the ground. This can be seen near the All Souls Chapel, where three shiny black headstones serve as training graves. The tour on the grounds explains the origin of why wakes became known as wakes, with its Victorian history retold to us in the present. Wakes were said to be traced back when mourners held a party graveside, keeping watch to see if the deceased could possibly awaken by chance. Of course, going back to Victorian times, it's hard to forget the old problem that sometimes people who were thought to be dead were in fact buried alive mistakenly. Rookwood, of course, saw a Victorian tactic implemented with bells attached to strings tied to the deceased's finger so that a bell could be rang. Should the dead accidentally awaken and need saving from being buried alive, the watchman on the graveyard shift kept watch and would also listen for bells. Nowadays, this rarely occurs with modern medicine and technology, but the retold horror story of being buried alive always makes for a good scare on a graveyard tour. Fittingly, the iconic Sydney Opera House, perched on its harbor, is impossible to miss. Yet, ironically, one of Australia's most celebrated bass baritones never performed inside its renowned halls. Born in Adelaide in 1882 to Scottish immigrants, Peter Smith Dawson's musical journey began early and never stopped. Joining a church choir at 17 and winning his first competition at 19, he studied under renowned teacher Sir Charles Sentley in London, where he trained extensively in classical music and oratorio. His career took off in both England and Australia, performing in major concert halls, including Covent Garden, and becoming one of the world's most recorded artists with over 1,500 to 3,500 recordings to his name. Dawson was known for his powerful bass baritone voice and extensive repertoire, which spanned from operatic arias to British and Australian folk songs. He had a strong presence on the concert stage, performing works by Handel, Mendelssohn, Brahms, and many others. Notably, he was a champion of British song and became a definitive voice for many of the classic ballads of his time. His recordings, particularly his renditions of songs like Clancy of the Overflow and The Floral Dance, made him a household name. Throughout his career, Dawson performed around the world and even contributed to the war effort during World War II with broadcasts and tours. He also played a key role in preserving classic British and Australian songs at the time when popular music was shifting. His last public performance came in 1961, and he sadly passed away the same year. Dawson's death marked the end of an era for Australian music, as he was one of the country's most beloved and respected vocalists. Despite his passing, his recordings continue to preserve his rich legacy. Dawson was described as a friendly, handsome, well built man who retained his boyishness all his life. And although he loved the limelight, remained unspoiled by fame and is interred within Rookwood. Rookwood's next famous interred is Louisa Lawson, an Australian poet, writer, publisher, and suffragist. Born in 1848 in New South Wales, Louisa was the second of 12 children in a struggling family. She married Norwegian sailor Niels Larsen at 18, and together they had four children, including the famous poet Henry Lawson. After moving to Sydney in 1882, Louisa became a passionate advocate for women's rights and played a pivotal role in Australia's suffragette movement. Louisa's contribution to Australian literature and feminism were immense. In 1887, she used her savings to invest in a radical newspaper, The Republican, which she and her son Henry edited, calling for a federated Australian republic. A year later, she launched The Dawn, Australia's first journal published entirely by women. The Dawn became a powerful platform for feminist causes, including women's suffrage, education, and legal rights. It was also a vehicle for Louisa's own poetry and Henry's early literary work. As a suffragist, Louisa founded the Dawn Club in 1889, which became a central meeting point for Sydney's suffragist activists. She was deeply involved in the campaign that led to women gaining the right to vote in 1902, and she was later celebrated as the mother of suffrage in New South Wales. In her later years, Louisa retired from publishing but continued to write, publishing poetry until her death until 1920. Despite a difficult final illness, Louisa Lawson's legacy as a writer, publisher, and feminist remained influential in Australian history. Lawson passed away on August 12th in 1920 at the age of 72 in Gladsville Mental Hospital. She's buried in the Church of England section of Rookwood Cemetery with her parents. Our next resident you've most likely never heard of by his real name, or is unknown to some Americans, but is Roy Rene, one of Australia's greatest comedic talents. Born Henry Vandersloot on February 15, 1891, in Adelaide, Rene became a household name in the early 20th century. Famous for his body and larger than life comedic persona, Mo McCackney. Rene began his career at a young age, performing vaudeville and pantomimes across Australia. After a stint as a jockey, he spent time in Melbourne, where he finally found his true calling in comedy. In 1916, he partnered with Nat Phillips to create an iconic duo, Stiffy and Mo, which became a massive hit. Their irrelevant lyric and humor captured the hearts of audiences, and for nearly a decade they dominated the Australian vaudeville scene. Renee's alter ego, Mo McCackney, was an exaggerated, cheeky character that parried with the Aussie larrikin. Lecherous, cheeky, and always getting into trouble, his popularity grew to a point where he was hailed as Australia's answer to Charlie Chaplin. In the late 1920s, after leaving Stiffy and Mo, Rene continued his success in solo acts, including partnerships like Blewett and Mo, and later Mo and his Merrymakers. Despite some personal struggles, including a near fatal battle with peritonitis in 1930, he kept performing through the 1930s and 40s. Though he made a brief foray into film with Strike Me Lucky in 1934, his true magic was always in live performances, where his rapport with his audience was unmatched. In the 1940s, Rene transitioned to radio, where his McCackney Mansion segment became a national sensation, and he continued to perform until the 1950s. Tragically, he passed away from heart disease at his home in Kensington, New South Wales, on the 22nd of November in 1954. Roy Rene was buried in the Jewish section of Rookwood Cemetery, but his legacy lives on through the Mo Awards, which honor excellence in live performances, and through the enduring influence of his character, Mo McCackney. Roy Renee's comedy was bold, raucous, and unapologetically Australian, and he remains one of the most significant figures in the history of Australian entertainment. When touring or wandering in Rookwood, you most likely find yourself at some point in the non denominational area of the cemetery, and hopefully noting one of his most famous interred, May Kwong Tart. He's one of Sydney's most beloved and influential figures, despite facing intense anti Chinese sentiment during his time. Born in 1850 in Guangdong, China, Kwong Tart immigrated to Australia in 1859. After years of learning and establishing himself, he became a prominent Sydney merchant and philanthropist. His most notable success was founding a chain of tea rooms, including the iconic Elite Hall and the Queen Victoria Market, now the Queen Victoria Building. His tea rooms were more than just places to enjoy tea. They became vibrant cultural hubs where meetings of suffragettes were held and where Clontarf developed progressive employment policies like paid sick leave for his staff. Quangtar was also a community leader and advocate for Chinese Australians, campaigning against the opium trade and for the establishment of a Chinese consulate in Australia. His contributions to both the Chinese and broader Australian communities earned him honors from the Chinese imperial government, including the prestigious title of the Mandarin of the Blue Button. But beyond his business acumen, Clontarf was a philanthropist, supporting causes like the Benevolent Society and hosting charity dinners. He was well known and respected figure across Sydney's social and political scene, frequently interacting with local elites and gaining popularity for his generosity and leadership. In his personal life, Clontarf married Margaret Scarlett, a British schoolteacher, in 1886 against her family's wishes, but they went on to have six children together, living a happy life. Despite racial prejudice at the time, he navigated his dual identity as a Chinese Australian gentleman, even raising his daughters at one of Sydney's finest private schools. Tragically, in 1903, Clontarf was brutally attacked in his office, leading to injuries that would eventually claim his life later that year. His death shocked Sydney and led to suspicions among his community about the circumstances of the crime. His funeral, held on the 28th in July 1903, featured the who's who of Sydney and was widely covered by the press. 200 men escorted his coffin from his Ashfield mansion to a train, which transported the funeral party to Rookwood Cemetery, where thousands of Sydney siders went to pay their last respects. Quang was dressed in his ceremonial robes of the Mandarin of the Blue Button under his Masonic apron as he was laid to rest. To honor his legacy, a statue was erected in his memory in Ashfield, and on the centenary of his death was celebrated in 2004 with a major exhibition and a conference at the Powerhouse Museum, and another exhibition was held in the Queen Victoria Building titled No Ordinary Man, Sydney's Quang Tart, Citizen, Merchant, and Philanthropist, curated by Dr. Nicola Tiefer. His contributions to Sydney and his influence continues to be celebrated today. What many in the old Chinese section will notice is it looks very bare. There's a lot of green space and spacious gaps in between headstones, giving the appearance the plots are unfilled, which they are now empty, but years back they were filled with Sydney's Chinese residents. So, where do they all go? For many Chinese immigrants, it's a traditional custom to return their loved ones' remains to their ancestral homeland, even after death, in the hope that their spirits will be reunited with their family. This process often involves exhuming the body and repatriating the remains to China, where they are reburied with relatives. The tradition typically begins with the initial burial outside the home village. After a period of about 7 years, the deceased bones are exhumed and placed in a golden pagoda on a hill outside the village before being finally transferred to the family vault. Visitors will also notice the Quang Sin's Tong Shrine that was erected in 1877. It was the center of the Chinese section and used by the community as a shrine for funeral ceremonial purposes. In 2008, restoration work saw it returned as close as possible to its original condition. Work included carving a new sandstone urn, replacing the rusted fencing, and repairs to the historic moat and entrance steps. The Office of Australian War Graves honors and respects those that fought for their country by maintaining war cemeteries, war memorials, and individual war graves throughout Australia. for members of the Commonwealth forces who died in the First and Second World Wars. They also commemorate eligible veterans who died post war and whose deaths were caused by their war services. In the Office of Australian War Graves, it maintains 112 graves of Australians and New Zealanders in this section in perpetuity in Rookwood. The Old Army Anglican section was established in 1888. At the time, both the military presence and the Anglican congregation were growing in the colony of New South Wales. Many grave sites originally had classical monuments, but due to weathering and damage, they were replaced with uniform military plaques during a refurbishment in 1943. This uniformity reflects Commonwealth practices, with war dead being commemorated uniformly, equally, and irrespective of their military or civil rank, race, or creed. One soldier buried on the grounds is John Barney Hines, a British born Australian soldier, famous for his role in World War I, especially for his looting of German military items during the Battle of Polygon Wood in 1917. Born Johanneshelm in Liverpool to German immigrant parents, he had a troubled early life, including criminal activity before moving to New Zealand and then Australia. He enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in 1915, where he became known for his aggressive combat style and his penchant for collecting German souvenirs, earning him the nickname Souvenir King. Hein's most famous photograph, taken by Frank Hurley, shows him surrounded by looted German equipment and money, and it became one of the most iconic Australian images of the war. You've most likely seen it without even knowing it. Despite his bravery in battle, Heinz was often punished for his indiscipline, including drunkenness and theft. After the war, he lived in poverty in Sydney, becoming a local figure. Though his mental health and financial difficulties persisted, he died in 1958 and was buried in an unmarked grave, later commemorated with a headstone and monument. His most famous photograph remains a symbol of his complex legacy as both a soldier and a man struggling to adapt to life after war. The biggest and most grandest mausoleum on the grounds is 130-year-old Fraser Mausoleum. In its past few years, the mausoleum saw less than better times, but more recently has been completely restored by the Friends of Rookwood group and efforts of the cemetery's heritage restoration and conservation team. The Frasers are no longer interred within, after Rookwood saw years of robbery, desecration, and neglect, with many prominent families removing their kin. The recent change of hands now has the cemetery in the hands of several trusts, performing restorations of epic proportions with the Fraser Mausoleum at the front of its efforts. The mausoleum is considered as one of the finest examples of Piermont sandstone architecture and is a potential World Heritage Site. It's the only mausoleum outside of Europe with a unique alabaster sarcophagi, making it a rare architectural masterpiece, which this October was reopened to the public for the first time in 50 years on October 22nd, 2024. Visitors were able to step inside the grand structure and experience the awe-inspiring craftsmanship up close. Who was this finest example of Piermont sandstone architectural for, though? John Fraser was an Irish born Australian businessman and politician. Fraser arrived in New South Wales in 1842 and became a successful merchant and director of several major companies. He was appointed to the New South Wales Legislative Council in 1874 and supported the University of Sydney with a significant donation. He also funded public drinking fountains in Sydney and contributed to the construction of a Presbyterian church in Springwood. Fraser spent his later years in his mansion, Ranelagh, and his country retreat, Silva Plana. He and his family were originally buried in the mausoleum and Rookwood Cemetery, but were removed by his great great granddaughter. His philanthropic legacy continues through the John Fraser Scholarship at the University of Sydney. The mausoleum was built in 1894, specified by John Fraser himself before his death. The doors bear his initials and those of his wife, JF and EF. In a cemetery filled with Sydney siders, one hard to find grave from 1877 might throw visitors for a loop. is the grave for American William Henry Harrison Davenport. Ira and William Davenport, known as the Davenport brothers, were 19th century American magicians famous for their spirit illusions, which they claimed were powered by supernatural forces. Beginning in the 1850s, they gained attention with their spirit cabinet trick, where they would be tied in a box and sounds from instruments or bells would play, making audiences believe spirits were involved. The brothers toured the US and Europe, but their tricks were repeatedly exposed as frauds by other magicians. Despite these exposures, they continued performing, often using Confederates to help with the illusion. William died in 1877 in Australia, and Ira briefly revived the act in 1895 with little success. While some spiritualists, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, defended them, evidence later revealed that the brothers' performances were indeed fraudulent, with Ira admitting to magician Harry Houdini that they did indeed use trickery. It's claimed William haunts Rookwood near his grave in the Church of England section, but with all the souls within, it's really hard to know. The cemetery is also one of the first grounds to allow burial for unbaptized infants. Called the Circle of Love, there's an area dedicated for aborted, stillborn, or unbaptized infants that can be found on the grounds. Some visitors claim they can hear the cries of babies when they visit this area. The ground shrines and memorials vary for all 90 religions and cultures, but also wars, plagues, and sicknesses. A Holocaust memorial for those lost in World War II is also dedicated on the grounds in the Jewish section, where families can pay their respects. Over the years, the cemetery grew not only in acres, but in diversity, just like Sydney, with adding sections as needed. Sydney's diversity in its cemetery is absolutely gorgeous. Cottages and chapels within the graves and gardens for caretakers and sextons from all over the years add charm to the notorious grounds in the City for the Dead. Rookwood's lengthy list of interred made this episode of The Grim hard to pick and choose from who to include, but that's what's great about leaving options for reopening this gate in the future. We'll definitely be back to Rookwood on the Grim as it lives up to being the largest cemetery in the Southern Hemisphere in all its Victorian splendor. Sydney, however, has come full circle as Rookwood in the next few years nears capacity, and once again are looking for options for a new burial ground. We'll just have to see what comes next. The grave grind for Rookwood Cemetery was a cold brew with milk from Gumption Coffee in Sydney. For more honorary grinds in the area, please visit the-grim.com. For now, we're closing the gate on Rookwood Cemetery. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today to join us next time when we open the gate on the Grim.